What I want to focus on is this thing that we've been talking about, which I'm going to call performativity. Yeah? The triumph of numbers, measurements, calculation, and the way in which this begins to permeate all aspects of life, not just what goes on in the public sphere, the public sector, but what actually goes on in culture, and actually also what goes on in our consulting rooms as psychotherapists. So I want to start with that issue of what goes on in our consulting rooms. I managed finally to give up the academic life about 4 years ago, having trained as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist about 12 years ago now. And as I moved slowly into this practice of mine, one of the things I was really struck by was how my training, which was very much in a kind of Kleinian object relations area, had not fully equipped me for the kind of patient that I was seeing in my practice. Because more and more what I was encountering was not guilt, conscious and unconscious guilt, but something quite different, shame. Yeah? And shame, a ubiquitous feeling coming through the door constantly of, as one of my patients put it to me recently, I'm just not enough. Yeah? That sense of not being good enough as a professional, as a worker, as a doctor, as a scientist, as a parent, as a partner, as a lover, wherever it is, that sense of not enoughness was becoming a quite remarkably consistent phenomena in terms of my practice. And I was slightly perplexed because, as I said, my training hadn't really prepared me for this. And I had to start looking elsewhere. And interestingly enough, shame in the United States in psychotherapy has become quite a big thing, particularly since the work of Heinz Hoggett in the early 1970s. But I think it's become quite a big thing because American culture in some ways goes where we follow, and in particular Hoggett, Kernberg, and then writers like Christopher Lasch talking about the culture of narcissism, I think began to open some of these windows into a world in which shame was, if you like, the shadow of performativity. That's how I think of it. So I want to explore that phenomena to begin with, then go into some of the more familiar things we've been talking about in terms of its impact specifically on the public sector and public services, and then finally move on to one of the key, if you like, market failures. Our earlier speakers this morning talked to us about how neoliberalism talks about the failure of the state failures, but one of the key market failures we are now facing is the destruction of our ecosystem and the rising impact, destructive effect of climate change. And that is a classic, massive market failure of the largest scale you can imagine. So, first of all, to think a little bit about shame. Shame, I think, cannot be understood if we don't also understand its relationship to the ideal. Some of you who are familiar with Freud's work will realise that Freud actually started to talk about the ego ideal before the superego. But once he began thinking about the superego, his notion of the ego ideal as something different became eclipsed and became incorporated into his notion of the superego and guilt. And therefore psychoanalysis' early interest in shame disappeared, and its preoccupation with guilt, as we know, developed over subsequent decades. Janine Chassaguet-Schmergel, a French psychoanalyst, I think was one of the key writers in the 70s and 80s to bring the notion of the ideal, the ego ideal, back into our way of thinking, and therefore the concept of shame back into the practice of psychotherapy. The ideal is by its nature unknowable and unachievable. That's a predicament. And many of the patients that I see are dominated by this notion of an ideal. As one patient graphically described it to me when she was trying to illustrate what she was constantly measuring her performance against, she said, you've got to imagine this what would you call it, a measuring device going up in the air, which is with various gradations. Because I'd been talking about the way in which she seemed to set her bar at an unrealisable level. And she said, well, the problem is actually I can't see the top of the bar. It disappears into this cloud of unknowing. The ideal is unknowable and unachievable in that sense. And it tantalises us and seduces us, nevertheless. And so shame inhabits the shadow of this ideal. This sense of just not being enough in the face of this ideal lover, father, parent, worker, whatever it might be. And I don't think we can actually understand the way in which, as modern workers in society, we participate in the kinds of regimes that we've been talking about, without understanding the way in which the grip of the ideal is a powerful motivating force for the new educated labour force that has emerged so powerfully since the 1960s. So my feeling about performativity, and one of the things that we've been, these issues that we've been talking about today, is that it is very much one of the key factors making for the emergence of these kinds of regimes is it's a new way of trying to discipline educated labour. In the old days, many of you maybe were like me, you did a bit of work in factories to earn pocket money, before you went to university. And in my day, when I worked in a furniture making factory, there was the person they called the time and motion man. And the time and motion man went round measuring, they were men, went round measuring, it was called work study later on, every action that a worker performed, say on a drilling machine or a lathe or whatever, measuring each action, timing those actions, so that a kind of standardised schedule of what each worker should be performing to target, if you like, in that factory was. And bonus systems were based upon that kind of time and motion study. The performative regimes we have now that we've been talking about today are, if you like, a very sophisticated form of time and motion now applied primarily to educational and professional labour. I think that's what we're seeing much of the time, this effort to measure, calculate, proceduralise, standardise the labour of an educated workforce, for whom the idea of success in career, in work, is something that manual workers wouldn't have in the same way. And that's where the ideal comes in. Because I think so many of us are still seduced and tantalised by the idea that we might leave our mark, that success in some sort of way is possible. So I think it's the ideal and its shadow, the fear, shame, and the fear of shame, which very much fuels our engagement in these performative regimes. A lot of current research that's been done in both private and public sectors on performative regimes talks about the way in which the modern educated worker, and I noticed this in my own university, a study was done on employers' requirements of our graduates. Employability, this notion of employability, is about your fitness to labour in the modern labour market of the private and public sector. And what it requires now is a kind of continuous physical, cognitive and emotional self-improvement. You can no longer rest on your laurels, as someone said earlier today. The self becomes an enterprising project that you have to continuously work at. What is enough? There is never enough. It is never enough. Whatever you do is never enough in modern organisations today. And they want all of us. So our graduates coming out of university, it's not just, employers don't just want a set of skills and knowledges. They want our graduates to have personality, flexibility, and crucially, transferability. So increasingly, it's the whole of the person that is required by the modern organisation in order to provide the kind of labour power that these new kinds of regimes want of us. So this leads us to one of this issue that we've been talking about today, about the triumph of measurement and numbers, because performative regimes depend upon the quantification of all aspects of life. This impulse towards measurement and control, and this fetishisation of numbers that we've been talking about. And what I want to focus on today is not just the way in which what counts is what can be counted, but more importantly, what happens to what can't count or what doesn't count? What happens to that aspect of life, in particular, in these kinds of performative regimes? The triumph of this way of thinking about what is true and real, also leads to disparagement of other ways of knowing. And I think that's very important for most of the people gathered here who are particularly interested in other ways of knowing, which rely more upon intuition, a sense of a sensing of what is going on in a room with a person, or what Rosie referred to earlier as this notion of presence. These are different forms of knowing to the kinds of knowing which performative regimes require. And I think often you find in modern organisations today, people who talk about the value and importance of those ways of knowing are regarded as woolly, soft-headed, impractical, subjective, and I think still to this day it's often regarded as being in some sort of way effeminate and not sufficiently masculine and phallic in the way in which knowledge should be. And yet, despite the triumph of numbers and this way of thinking about the world in terms of measurements and so on, reality keeps breaking in through this kind of virtual reality that we've been creating. It broke in the financial crash in 2008, and it's breaking in repeatedly now around the issue of climate change. So how does this then affect the actual person themselves? Because I think as a part of culture, this gets right into the soul. This performative type of regime gets right into the soul. And then just a few examples. A number of people have mentioned Fitbit already, but I think in some sort of way it does exemplify something. Deborah Lupton, an Australian sociologist, refers to what she calls self-tracking cultures, which is Fitbit users have got all sorts of networks, online networks that they can participate in, and they've got their own website called the Quantified Self. And I recommend you go to it if you want to have a few sleepless nights, because here people really are talking about the way in which quantification can resolve all the mysteries of life, including, for example, some of the mysteries of spirituality, and so on and so forth. Self-tracking cultures. I'll just read this from a paper that I wrote last year. Deborah Lupton sees Fitbit as a harbinger of what she calls these self-tracking cultures. Self-trackers are forming their own communities online around fitness centres and websites, where they can download and share their Fitbit data and benchmark their performances against peers. Self-trackers engage in a constant process of monitoring their vital signs, pulse, blood pressure, blood oxygen saturation levels, as they push, run, push weights, chill, work and sleep. Lupton cites one self-tracker saying, "My goal is to basically be an optimal human being in every aspect of my life." So quantification comes right into the way in which we begin to think about ourselves. Facebook likes, another lovely example. One of my patients is obsessed with Facebook likes. He knows it's ridiculous. He knows he shouldn't be obsessed with Facebook likes. But in some sort of way, if he can get 75 likes for something, it gives him a sense of being, of security in his being. It gives him that kind of sense of ontological security, briefly, for a few moments of time. An academic recently asked me if I'd participate in an online petition about something. And I noticed at the end of his letter, his message, he not only had his name and his job title and his recent publication, but he now had his Google citation record. 1,475 citations he could proudly boast. As if this in some sort of way gave him a secure sense of self, of worth and who he was. A lot of the research that's been done on body dysmorphia now talks about body surveillance and the way in which young men and women in particular constantly and anxiously measure the millimetres and calories of their intake and their body size and so on. In all of these dimensions, the self becomes confused with its auditable surface. I count, therefore I am. Just a cartoon which I thought was helpful. So, I've been talking about performativity and work. What about performativity and governance then? Which is one of the themes of the conference and a number of the presentations so far today. Well, when in my previous life, so to speak, I was very much involved in working as a trainer, consultant and researcher to public service organisations at a place called the School for Advanced Urban Studies at Bristol University. Started there in 1981, second year into the Thatcher administration, just as all of these reforms were getting under steam. And after 4 years, a new boss of my department took over, Julian Legrand, who's already been mentioned this morning, who was one of the key thinkers in terms of the idea of quasi-markets and the role of choice in schools, for example, and so on. I think it's important to understand that these kinds of models of rational, self-interested consumers that were adopted by particularly the Labour government in the 1997 administration are based very much on a kind of pre-psychological notion of the human being. The human being as a rational, self-interested actor, which is basically what I call in our Climate Psychology Alliance a Spockist notion of what it means to be human. You know, Spock out of Star Trek. That in some sort of way, if we are given the right information as parents, we will choose the right school. Yeah? That we are logical information processing actors working according to our best interests. Of course, we know it's just not like this. And indeed, since the crash, public choice theorists and people involved in the new public management themselves have become aware of the limitations of that notion of rationality. And so increasingly these days people talk about bounded rationality, and they use certain aspects of social psychology and neuropsychology to begin to help them understand some of these aspects of more bounded rationality. That we're not just information processing animals, but we actually, have defaults, for example, that we fall back upon, that we have informational shortcuts that we use, and so on. You could say it's a step forward. It is a step forward from a pre-psychological to a rudimentary psychological understanding of the human being. But what is missing still is anything we would think of as depth, as any notion of the human being possessing some kind of inner world, which your story of, was it Sarah, so beautifully illustrated. So the new public management begins to emerge in the late 1980s, and the paradox, of course, is that it emerges in the context of an increasingly unregulated private sector and an increasingly regulated public sector. So that's the paradox that we've been talking about for the last 20 odd years. And one of the key rhetorics of new public management in the 80s was this rhetoric we've heard already today, getting more for less. And there's a number of very interesting studies, which I'll just whip through very quickly, which were done on just looking at the way in which these techniques and approaches became ubiquitous to the entire world of the public service. Whether you're talking about probation or nursing or mental health nursing or the care of the elderly or cleaning in hospitals, you get the same phenomena occurring over and over again. So, take regulation. Kieran Walsh study in 2003 estimated that besides the Prime Minister's delivery unit, the Treasury, etc., a further 20 regulatory bodies were engaged in overseeing performance in healthcare. One of the problems, of course, with the reforms that were put in process by Labour and Conservative governments was that by trying to devolve managerial decision-making to units such as hospitals, schools, and so on, you create a risk in the process of devolving. And so regulation, if you like, becomes a perverse attempt to manage this kind of risk that you've created by creating these decentralised units, which are then set about competing with each other. Professional work becomes increasingly bureaucratised. We've talked about this already. But I think there's just some interesting stats. By 2002, it's estimated that in the UK, over 250 forms were in regular use by the police force, who spent 43% of their time in their offices and just 17% on regular patrol. Home care, a study by Charles Patmore in 2004. Purchasers, local authority purchasers, who are now purchasing home care from a range of private and voluntary providers, would initially assess each customer and prescribe how many visits per week, the exact time of day for each visit, exactly what tasks should be done on each visit, the precise length of each visit. This is time and motion, isn't it? Now applied to the care of your old mum. Yeah? Contracting out cleaning services in hospitals. Very interesting study funded by Unison, done in Scotland in 2009, on the impact of contracting out cleaning in Scottish hospitals. What can't be counted? Yeah? Well, what can be counted? What can be counted are the physical routines of the cleaning job. Yeah? What isn't counted, and therefore gets lost completely through the process of contracting out, are these things that are most important to patient care. The contribution of the cleaner to the ward team, the contribution of the cleaner to the care of patients in terms of chatting, running errands, and so on and so forth. And the result that they found, lower patient satisfaction, and it was more difficult to contain the spread of hospital infections, with the breakup of cleaning from the rest of the health and care services on the ward. Child protection, which I'm sure we'll hear more about tomorrow. The response to repetitive moral panics about abused children was to continuously tighten up the control procedures in child protection social work. So each time there was a panic about a neglected child, you would get successive waves of new guidance, procedures, risk assessment instruments, and so on and so forth. And the Monroe report on child protection social work put this very much into view in terms of her critique of what she called the rational technical approach that then dominated and still dominates child protection work to this day. It has fostered the view that the most important part of social work is carried out on a computer. But if we take the perspective of children and their parents, the most important activity work takes place when social workers meet children and families, try to communicate with them, work with them, and help them to change. In other words, there is something about that face-to-face encounter, what you call presence earlier on, which gets lost in this new proceduralised approach to child protection social work. So, a number of writers started to talk about the perverse consequences of target culture. Interestingly enough, some of this evidence was around way back in the 1970s. One of the earliest attempts to introduce performativity into the police force was in Chicago, in the United States, in the 1970s. And there's a brilliant book by an American sociologist called Studs Terkel, and he looked at the impact of the introduction of these kinds of performance measures on the Chicago police force. And lo and behold, what happens? They begin directing their work towards where the known targets are, and neglecting those areas of work which aren't governed by the targets. They start to become skilled in impression management, and so on and so forth. But perhaps one of the most important consequences, perverse consequences of target culture, is the actual breakdown of trust. That workers themselves become increasingly disenchanted, and as they become more and more disenchanted, their motivation, their professional motivation is sapped, and they become more untrustworthy as far as management is concerned, which leads to the attempt to control them more, to introduce more measures and indicators, and that breaks down trust even further. It generates, therefore, paradoxically, not performance, but actually conformance, something quite different. So a world of appearances is created in which it looks as if we're getting more for less and quality is being maintained. Whereas in actual fact, lots of the research suggests what we're getting is selective reporting and manipulation of information. Classic example in terms of hospital waiting lists, for example. The crowding of performance to meet targets. So crowding occurs where you're given a target and the target is related to financial incentives, but you know that if you exceed the target, they will only increase the target the next year. So you never exceed your target, you always just underperform the target. And you crowd, that's called crowding, you crowd your performance just to below where the target is set. So gaming, people start to realise how the system operates. Managers and staff begin to realise, this is the game, so this is how we have to play it, to look after ourselves. And I was kind of reminded of someone referred to social defences against anxiety earlier on. It's a very interesting book by Susan Long called The Perverse Organisation, written in 2007, just before the crash. It's a study of a number of organisations, including some on Wall Street, based on Wall Street, like long-term capital management. She also did a study of Enron, where she argued that there was a new kind of social defence emerging in these organisations, which she called the perverse offence. And one of the key aspects of that perverse offence was the use of performance indicators to make it look as if the organisation was succeeding and meeting its targets. Enron was a classic example. So a kind of illusional bubble is created, which, as with Enron and other organisations like Lehman Brothers and so on, eventually bursts. And the illusion in that sense is broken. And I was reminded in psychoanalysis there is a similar notion of the as-if phenomena. That's related to a kind of a twisting of the idea of what we think of as change and progress. An outward impression of understanding and progress occurs, this is in the therapeutic situation, while in fact the whole process lacks something real, does not feel genuine, and seems to be going nowhere. So, in this kind of way, I think it looks as if the government is meeting its targets, but as with education, in a subtle and perverse kind of way, it is weakening the very thing that it says that it's improving. And I wrote about this in a paper several years ago, using education as a very specific example, where, if you remember at that time, and I think it still exists today, British children were the most tested children in all OECD countries. This is under New Labour. And all of New Labour's, all of the stats seem to suggest that our children their educational performance was improving. But if you use the PISA rankings, which are an international set of rankings comparing children's abilities across a range of countries, all that they demonstrated was that our children's ability to pass tests was improving, but on the key indicators of science, maths and English, British children were actually going backwards. So this is the kind of as-if notion of change and progress that I think this kind of performativity leads to. It's as if, therefore, what we see is the real thing. And I think professional staff and managers struggle to preserve their grip on reality. They're told things are improving, and yet their experience tells them very much the opposite. It's a very interesting study by Knights and Clark of academics and their experience of these performative regimes. And they come up with what they call 3 categories of insecurity that these regimes create. Imposters constantly have the feeling that they're not as capable or adequate as others think they are. I think you often come across people feeling that they're a bit of an imposter, as a GP or as an academic or whatever it might be. Aspirants were people who still aspired to succeed. The ideal, the notion of the ideal, was something that they were still gripped by, and the idea of recognition that they might achieve at some point in time. And what they call the existentialists, who I should imagine are most people here, who have a feeling that what they're doing seems to lack the kind of purpose and passion and integrity that brought them into the job in the first place. Yeah. So workers are beset by anxieties about whether they're doing enough, and that's about shame, or whether what they're doing isn't actually what they should be doing, which I think elicits guilt. And crucially then, pupils, clients, patients, claimants become objects to be acted upon, not subjects to be understood and engaged with. And I think that shift from subjects of care, attention, and so on, to objects of intervention is a kind of crucial shift that has occurred within these performative regimes. And I think what it means, increasingly, is that the intrinsic value of what it means to be human, as a patient, as a pupil, as an elderly person receiving care, or the intrinsic value of other forms of life as well, is being destroyed. And what is becoming more and more important is, if you like, is the on-the-surface extrinsic value of something. And I want to just explore this a little bit in terms of the destruction of nature. Because all of these techniques that we're talking about are now also deployed in terms of environmental sustainability practices and attempts by economists to measure nature and the services that nature provides. So you find economists now talking about ecological services. They'll look at the Amazon jungle, for example, and talk about the ecological services that the jungle provides, along with other jungles in tropical areas, and will attempt to quantify that. Because if it can be quantified, the argument is, then we're in a position to know whether it is worth preserving or not. If you can't price it and quantify it, then how can you protect it? Another concept that's emerged more recently is what they call critical natural capital. So when something becomes increasingly endangered and rare, perhaps a particular aspect of the soil system in the American Midwest, it becomes known as critical natural capital. And again, as it becomes more critical, its value increases, and therefore its price increases. This is the argument. Economists are also busily involved in trying to do what they call estimating the discount rate to be applied to the needs of future generations. Again, to quantify it, the needs of our children and grandchildren in the future, to weigh those needs into the, if you like, accounting procedures that organisations like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change try and take into consideration. So endangered species and ecosystems then become disposable assets which may be preserved or may be reluctantly written off. And I'll give you an example, which is the Great Barrier Reef. So, last year, some of you may be aware that the Great Barrier Reef, which is presently, like most other coral reefs in the world, is presently endangered. Last year, economists decided that they needed to give a value to the Great Barrier Reef. So they got one of the big consultancy firms, Deloitte's, to come in and do a study of the value, economic value, of the Great Barrier Reef in terms of the services that it provided. Like the services in terms of the leisure industry in Australia, services, the more intangible services that it provided in terms of biodiversity and the sort of ecosystems around which were essential for fish stocks in that part of the Pacific Ocean, and so on and so forth. And you'll be pleased to know that at the end of the study, Deloitte's valued the Great Barrier Reef at $56 billion. Okay. Oh, I thought, oh, this is quite interesting. So this is in our climate psychology discussion group. I looked at, just to get an estimate of this, the world's most expensive painting at the present moment is Gauguin's "When Will You Marry Me?" When will you marry? And it recently sold to some Qataris for just over 300 million. So if you work it out, it means the Great Barrier Reef is worth about 170 Gauguins. Now, what's going on here? I think what's going on is that we're this deliberate failure to understand the intrinsic value of nature, of the Great Barrier Reef, and barrier reefs around the world in that kind of way, is almost preparing the way for them to be written off. Yeah? So if you look at the IPCC report that came out 2 weeks ago, it's now quite clear that if we pursue not even a business as usual trajectory, because the business as usual trajectory is going to get us to something like between 3 and 5 degrees overshoot in terms of global average temperatures. But even if we managed through some dramatic way to reach a 2-degree global average temperature by decarbonising our economies quite dramatically, 99% of all coral reefs will disappear by the end of this century. And if we reach 1.5%, which is well nigh impossible now, over 60% of barrier reefs will be, of coral reefs will disappear in the world. So I think this very process of applying kind of performative principles and models to nature itself, what role do coral reefs perform for us as a human species, is a prelude to perhaps writing them off. And finally, not just aspects of nature, I think, becoming superfluous, but people's as well. Hannah Arendt, who, as many of you know, wrote one of the most important books on the nature and emergence of totalitarianism, described totalitarianism as an impulse to total control, exemplified in its darkest moments in the concentration camps. And the impulse to total control requires what is human, and this is what she described in the camps: compassion, spontaneity, vulnerability, what she called natality in her later work. It requires what is human, most human, to be extinguished. And I think we can start to see how the ground is being prepared for that kind of how we are going to treat the superfluous in the coming period. Windrush, I think, is a kind of sign of the times. Yeah? And the use of bureaucratic, administrative, target-driven. Yeah? What did Amber Rudd say 2 days ago? That the Windrush generation, the civil servants were being driven by removals targets. That was the phrase that she used. Yeah? So this whole language and techniques of performativity, I think in some sort of way are maybe preparing the ground for this kind of management of superfluousness. And if you think I'm being far-fetched, well, it's already been thought about. The Anthropocene, some of you are familiar with that concept, no doubt. But we are, this system that we've been talking about today, neoliberalism, we are destroying the very conditions that made civilization possible 11,000 years ago. And as regions become uninhabitable, so their populations will become increasingly superfluous. And the politics of what's called the armed lifeboat, in a book by Ian Angus, I think we can begin to see increasingly in the world today. And here we are, this is the Bush administration thinking about this very thing back in 2003. I've clicked something there, I'm not quite sure what. So mass migration is going to be, I think, very much something which we're going to see in the future if we continue heading down the route that we're going down. So the issue of how do we handle both superfluous human populations and superfluous aspects of nature, I think, is something that this set of techniques and this language that we're talking about, it's where it's taking us. Okay.